Welcome back to our first breakout session. My name is Charlie Vogel, Executive Director of Minnesota Wheat, and I appreciate all of you attending. This is the Minnesota Legislative Update. Excited to have two great speakers to give us their take on all things legislative for the state of Minnesota. First up will be Amber with Minnesota Farm Bureau, and we will also have Bruce Kleven with Minnesota Wheat. So thank you. Amber, are you ready?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Charlie. I'm looking forward today to providing an election overview and kind of what we can expect for the next coming few years. I'll be providing an update first on the federal level, and then we'll be turning it over to Bruce Kleven, who will provide an update on the state level. I think in 2020, everybody was just very excited to see November 3rd come and go. It was a long campaign season, and it seems like even after the election day, it continued to drag out. So at the federal level, I'll start kind of at the top and work our way down. And I think obviously a lot of eyes were on the presidential race as we saw Trump run for a second term and Biden former Vice President Biden challenging President Trump. When the Electoral College meets on December 14th, the election results will become certified. And as it stands right now, Vice President Biden has 306 and President Trump has 232. And obviously that magical threshold is 270. So we will see President-elect Biden come into office later in January. President-elect Biden and his Vice President-elect Harris have hit the ground running with starting to fill out their cabinet positions, which is obviously very exciting to watch. Tom Vilsack will be nominated for Secretary of Agriculture and will head up USDA. That name is very familiar to many in agriculture as he served as the secretary under the Obama administration. One of the good things about a returning face is that his experience will let him hit the ground running and be able to get to work. And as we know in agriculture, there are a lot of issues that will need his attention. Some of the things that will be high on his priority list will be climate change, strengthening the Farm Bill, broadband, and trade. Some of the other cabinet positions we're watching very closely include the U.S. Trade Representative. Catherine Tai will be nominated to serve that position. She's currently the trade lawyer for the House Ways and Means Committee and has made a big name for herself in that role as she handled the USMCA talks between the House Democrats and the Trump administration. She also previously led China enforcement efforts at the USTR, so she definitely has experience in the agency, but also with the issues that are going to be very important to agriculture as we continue to watch enforcement of the China Phase 1 deal. There are also other positions. John Kerry has been tapped to be the global climate czar. While this is not a Senate-approved position, it is definitely a highlight of the Biden administration's focus on climate change. The head of the EPA has yet to be announced, but there are definitely some names that are being speculated, so we'll continue to keep a close eye on that as the future of EPA or the future of RFS and other important issues that we've worked on over the last few years will rest in that position. One that's not directly related to agriculture, but was a name that we're all familiar with is the head of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, will be Representative Marcia Fudge. She is a member of the House Ag Committee, so that will definitely add some impacts to the Ag Committee moving forward. She was also high on the list for Secretary of Agriculture, so we are keeping an eye on where she landed. It's also been really interesting to watch President-elect Biden announce members of his staff and other leadership positions. And a trend that we've definitely seen is it's a lot of familiar faces. For instance, this morning, Susan Rice was announced that she will run the White House Domestic Policy Council, a name we're very familiar with in politics. And Minnesota's own Dennis McDonough will lead the Veterans Affairs. That was Obama. Definitely that are familiar to former Vice President Biden and names that are familiar to the American public. Moving on to the Senate, we'll be looking forward to a new Congress starting January 3rd, 2021. Although the current Congress definitely has a lot of work cut out for them as they are currently working to fund the government. They're looking at passing a 1-week extension to keep the government funded through December 18th, but will then either need to pass a continuing resolution or appropriations bills to move forward. There's also still discussions ongoing of what the next economic stimulus package could look like, but that's definitely contentious between all sides. So there could be a lot of work left for the current Congress, but looking ahead to the next Congress in early January, at the Senate, very close and still undecided. To lead the Senate, you need 51 seats. Currently, the Republicans have 50 and Democrats have 48. There are 2 Georgia Senate seats that are facing a runoff election on January 5th. And so with the control of the Senate up for grabs, all eyes are definitely in the South right now. Early voting on that begins on Monday. And so if our friends down in Georgia are being inundated with get out the vote and more campaign ads that we are fortunate enough to not have to deal with since November, that leads to a very interesting dynamic of what the Senate could end up being in the next Congress. If the Senate ends up being 50-50, if the Dems pick up both of those Georgia Senate seats, VP Harris would be the tie-breaking vote. But there are also multiple scenarios that lead up to that point. Congress begins January 3rd, but the new presidential administration doesn't take place until January 20th. So for January 3rd to January 5th, until that Georgia special Senate election, Republicans will have 51, Dems will have 48, and we have VP Pence. So that's the scenario for the first few days of Congress. After that special election, it could be from January 5th to January 20th, a tie with Republicans having 50 seats, Democrats having 50 seats, and we have VP Pence as the tiebreaker. So for 15 days, Republicans would have a majority with the tiebreaker with the VP. After January 20th, and you have a tied Senate, you'd have VP Harris, so it could flip. Or we're looking at a split of 51-49 or 52-48. Regardless of how the vote ends up on January 5th, it's going to be a very close Senate. And so that will definitely keep dynamics interesting, as you need to keep your parties in line to keep those votes close. But it will definitely add some interesting dynamics as we move forward. Assuming Republicans keep control, as the 2 seats currently held by the Georgia senators are both Republicans. As we look at Ag Committee breakout, the presumed new chair of the Senate Ag Committee would be John Boozman of Arkansas. Former Ag Committee Chairman Pat Roberts of Kansas retired, and his humor and his leadership will be greatly missed, but looking forward to working with a presumed chair, John Boozman. Senator Debbie Stabenow from Michigan would remain as the ranking member if Republicans keep control. Debbie Stabenow is the only returning member of the Ag Committee leadership, so she definitely brings that depth of knowledge and experience back to the table, but we'll definitely see a lot of changing in the Ag Committee, and I'll touch on that when we move on to the House in just a second. From a Minnesota specific piece, Minnesota Senator Tina Smith was up for re-election this year, and she was re-elected and will serve a full 6-year term. Because of how she took office as an appointment to fill former Senator Franken's seat, and then for the special election to fill the remainder of the term, she's had quite a few elections recently, but has now will be serving a full 6-year term. Moving on to the House, the Democrats retained majority, which they had in the last Congress and will continue to have, but Republicans picked up a lot of ground, and it is now a much closer House than we've seen in recent years. Democrats will have 222, and the Republicans will have 213, and you need 218 seats for that majority. So again, very close, which will lead to interesting dynamics in the House, and pair that with the Senate. We'll have some interesting policy debates over the coming years. In Minnesota, we lost one incumbent. Congresswoman-elect Michelle Fischbach won Congressional District 7 over Chair Colin Peterson. And that in and of itself will have major impacts on the Ag Committee moving forward. Representative David Scott of Georgia has been tapped to lead the House Ag Committee, filling Colin Peterson's role. Representative Scott had Peterson's endorsement in that race for the chair. Jim Costa of California was the other one who had thrown his name in the hat on that end. And Representative G.T. Thompson of Pennsylvania will be the ranking member, as Representative Conaway from Texas retired as well. So both leadership positions in the House Ag Committee will be new, but they have both indicated that they want to continue that tradition of the House Agriculture working together in a bipartisan fashion and reaching across the regional differences that we see in agriculture as well, which is really good to hear that tone that Chair Peterson set will continue on. Committee assignments have yet to be released, so we don't know what the committee makeup will be with other members and leadership as well. But one thing we do know is that with the makeup of the House, that the seats will be very close in the Ag Committee with just a few seat difference between the two different parties. So it will be imperative that they do work together. We know that a lot of Minnesota members of Congress serve on the Ag Committee and will continue to do so. We know Congresswoman-elect Michelle Fischbach has indicated her interest in continuing to represent that district and that committee as well. We have Representative Hagedorn, who served on that committee in the past as well. So lots of Minnesota influence still on the committee, but obviously things will look very different with the difference of chair. As we look at that committee, both the chairman and the ranking member have indicated that climate change will be a top priority. Obviously, they're coming at it from a little different viewpoints, but we can expect that to be a hot topic at the federal level. And as I'm sure Bruce will indicate later, we'll see that make progress at the state level as well. Other issues that we're expecting will be broadband, disaster response, and preparing for the next farm bill, which I'm not sure we're all ready for as we're just 2 years into this farm bill, but it's time for those discussions to pick back up as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to my friend Bruce for an update at the state level, and then happy to answer any questions.
Good. Okay, Amber, thank you for that introduction. When we were tasked with the legislative update, Amber took the federal and I'm going to take the state, but at the end, we'll take any questions you have. We all know it's sort of an awkward format, but I think there's a chat button or some way to send that in. So I'll speak for a few minutes here on St. Paul, and then if you have anything, shoot it our way here. I got a little screen down here I can see that on, so if somebody shoots something, we'll get it. My report on the state backs up to last spring. I just have to touch on last spring. This session last year was a non-budget year. That meant that nothing absolutely had to be done. There was certainly a wish list. But the session started in February. We moved along for a couple of weeks, and then all of a sudden this COVID thing hit, and it hit Minnesota pretty hard. On Friday, March 13th, Governor Walz issued the peacetime emergency order. That's still in effect to this day, but it was issued way back on March 13th. After that happened, the following Monday, the 16th, the four legislative leaders got together and decided to suspend legislative activity until further notice. And so we left the building, and to be honest, I have not been back there since. We've done a lot of work by Zoom. We've seen a lot of committee meetings by Zoom and so forth, but I haven't been back in the building since March 16th. So the legislature shut down, they limped along till May, and then they took off with the constitutional adjournment date. They have been back in special sessions several times since March. The reason for that has to do with that executive order. Governor Walz can issue an executive order for 30 days, but after 30 days, he has to renew it in order for it to remain in effect. And so he's done that 7 or 8 times now since March 13th. But whenever he does that, Minnesota law requires that the legislature have a chance to pass on that question, should that executive order be extended. The only way they can pass on that question is to be in the chamber. And the only way that can happen is the governor calls them back. So this has happened throughout the summer and fall. On or about the 12th, 13th, 14th of each month, the legislature will meet in special session. Sometimes it's for a couple hours, sometimes it's been for a couple of days. But nevertheless, they take a vote on the question. The Senate Republicans have consistently voted to end the peacetime emergency. The House Democrats have not, and therefore it remains in effect. So most things have not affected agriculture during the special sessions, but in October, there was major movement on a piece of legislation that we had worked with other ag groups, the Farm Bureau, the union, and other business groups to pass, and that has to do with Section 179 conformity. In the 2017 federal tax bill, there was a little glitch that didn't get picked up in Minnesota's bill, and that had to do with like-kind exchanges. Some of you faced the impacts from this. You went to trade the combine, and in past years, the like-kind exchange would not have been recognized as income. But beginning in 2018, those trades were recognized as income. So that got fixed this year finally. Representative Paul Marquardt here locally in Dilworth is chair of the House Tax Committee. He worked on this along with the Senate members. There were multiple members in the Senate. But Chairman Marquardt shepherded that through the House. And now that provision's been passed. So going forward in 2020, like-kind exchanges will not be treated as income, and those provisions are retroactive to trades made in 2018 and 19. I don't have the particulars for you this morning, but if you were affected by that in past years, go see your accountants and they can help you out this year. So that's what's happened on the special sessions. We're going to have one next week. I think it's been called for the 14th, and that possibly could involve a COVID relief package. We've been hearing rumors about that, but we'll see next week. So after the special session in October, we shifted towards the election. Amber covered the federal legislation and the elections. We had quite a impact here in Minnesota as well at the local level. Now, going into the election, Governor Walz was not on the ballot. He has 2 years left in his term. So there was no statewide race in terms of Minnesota legislature, but all 201 seats were up, all the Senate members and all the House members. Now, because of some of the anti-Trump sentiment in the suburbs and the fact that Donald Trump almost carried Minnesota in 2016, there was a huge get out the vote effort on the part of the Democrats. Going into the session, or into the election, the Senate was controlled by the Republicans by a very slim margin. It was 35 to 32. So the Democrats were targeting 2 seats. They needed to pick up 2 seats to get the majority. The strategy was to concentrate in the second and third ring suburbs, and those are places like Maple Grove, Plymouth, Shakopee, and so on. If they could get 2 seats, they would take the majority. And part of the thinking there was to capture the Biden coattails on the turnout. The net effect at the end of the election was the Republicans actually kept the Senate. They did lose 1 seat, but the margin now is 34 to 33. Very thin margin, but it still matters. And the reason it matters is because when you have the majority, you get to pick the agenda of the committee chairs and the direction the body will take, even though it's a thin margin. Now, one thing's happened in the Senate since the election that I want to make note of, and that is 2 longtime Iron Range members left the Democratic Party. They're tired of the rhetoric really on both sides, but really within their own party. A lot of the metro environmentalists have been going up to the Iron Range trying to tell them what to do on mining and timber and so forth. If you look at what's going on with Polymet, twin metals, the Line 3 replacement, all those things, the environmental groups have tried to stop all of those projects. And of course, for the Iron Rangers, that means jobs. So Senator Tom Bach out of Cook up in the Arrowhead, and David Tomasoni over in Chisholm, in the middle of the Iron Range, left the party a couple of weeks ago. So that actually makes the count in the Senate not 34-33, but technically is 34-32, 31 and 2, with 2 independents. They didn't go so far as to actually officially join the Republican Party. They are officially classified as independents, but they both feel that this way they can represent their districts better. Now, both men were awarded committee chairmanships. Senator Bach will chair the bonding committee going forward for the next 2 years. Senator Tomasoni will have higher ed. So they may caucus with the Republicans. I'm not sure about that, but they will definitely vote with them on a lot of the budget bills because they will be part of that process now going forward. Over in the House was controlled by the Democrats going into the election by a margin of 75 to 59. So it was a fairly comfortable margin for them going into the election. Again, there was the possibility of picking up a seat or 2 in the suburbs, depending upon turnout. That did not happen. The House Democrats actually lost a net of 5 seats. The count now there going into the session in January will be 70 to 64. So if you have an environmental issue that might upset the Iron Range, 3 Iron Rangers in the House or 3 rural members in the House defecting from that vote will tie the House floor up at 67-67. So that will make the management of the floor a little bit more difficult for the House Democrats going forward than it was in the past 2 years. But nevertheless, they keep control. They get to pick the committee chairs and the agenda in the House. Now, a couple of the folks in the House that lost were involved in agriculture and environment. Representative Jean Poppy from Austin down in south central Minnesota lost her reelection. She had been the Ag Finance Chair for the past 2 years. The vice chairman of the committee, Jeff Brand from St. Peter, also lost his reelection. And up in Bemidji, John Purcell lost his seat and he was chair of environment policy. So that has shuffled the deck over in the House and we'll have new committee chairs there. The Ag and Finance and Policy Committee will be chaired by Mike Sundin. He's a representative from Esco, Minnesota. If you've never been to Esco, it's just southwest of Duluth along the freeway. He has some agriculture in the district. It's mostly cattle, cow, calf, and some dairy. Not a lot of wheat, but he does have some ag. and he's a rural member. He's not from the metro. In the Senate, Senator Tory Westrom, a longtime friend of the industry, he'll continue to chair Ag Finance and Policy going forward. So we worked with Senator Westrom for a number of years, and he will continue to be a supporter of the industry. So that's the layout from the election. Going forward, the next session will start on January 5th. Now, this will be the budget year coming up in 2021. It'll last until the third Monday in May. The reason it lasts until the third Monday in May is because our state constitution requires the legislature to leave town on the third Monday in May at midnight. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they'll have the work done. They could go into a special session in June if they don't come together on a budget. The primary lift this year and the biggest focus clearly will be the budget. Minnesota's last two-year budget was $48.6 billion with a B, 48.6. The most recent economic forecast that was taken about a week ago shows that Minnesota will likely have a projected budget deficit during that next two-year cycle of $1.3 billion and some change. Now, this is quite a swing from just a few months ago in May. If you go back to May when all the shutdown was going on and people were sheltering at home and so forth and everything was closed, that had a major impact on sales tax receipts and revenue to the government. So in May, there was a deficit projected of 4.7, which is a huge number and represents about 10% of that 48 billion. Well, now it's swung back and it's closed. A couple of things to keep in mind about the budget as we go forward. Number one, we do have a budget reserve of 2.3 to 2.4 billion. That could be used to cover a lot of that gap. We also have the federal conversation going on. The feds allocated 2.2 billion to Minnesota last spring. There's been discussion about a package in the works for several weeks. If that comes forward, that may also offset some of those deficit issues as well. And the final thing to keep in mind in the budget is where the money goes. When you address a budget of this magnitude, keep in mind that three areas take up 80% of that budget. The first is K-12. K-12 takes up 40% of our general fund spending. Health and Human Services is next at 30% and growing. It's expected that Health and Human Services will take over K-12 in the next couple of years. That's at 30% right now and rapidly growing. The final area is higher ed. Higher ed takes about 10% of the budget. So when you add those three areas up, 80% of our state general fund spending comes in those three areas. And also interesting in there is that all three of those areas are chronically short of money. You always hear K-12 is short, hospitals, nursing homes, and so forth. Healthcare issues are always short, and then higher ed as well. Tuitions are going through the roof and so forth. So when the legislature addresses a budget deficit or even a surplus, they're doing it in the context of those three big areas. In terms of process, we don't know what the building will look like. Again, it remains closed here today. We do know that they're going to start remotely like we're doing here today. There'll be a lot of cameras. It's a very difficult, awkward format to lobby in that kind of environment. But to start in January, we aren't doing a lot of the lift. That doesn't come until March anyway. But I think we're going to start remotely. I don't think they're going to do a lot to begin with. They'll probably do some agency overviews and things like that. But they'll really roll up their sleeves towards the end of February when we get the next budget forecast. In terms of issues aside from the budget, and again, this depends on the format. If it turns out that we work a lot remotely and they just want to deal with the budget and get out of town by May, we may not see a lot of policy issues. But if we do, some of the things that we see in ag will probably fall into two major boxes. One is climate change and the other is water quality. So on climate change, we have the Governor's Task Force on Climate Change meeting right now. They're looking at how to increase the state's participation in renewable fuels, for example, biofuels, how to meet the renewable energy goals that were set in 2007. We know the corn growers are going to come with their E15 bill again. Right now it's E10. Corn growers led an effort last year to increase the state mandate to E15, and we expect them to do that again. But climate change can also involve cover crops and carbon sequestration and livestock emissions and all those kind of things. Governor Walz has made this a priority, so we expect, if they get into policy, that climate change will be certainly one of those discussions. The other box I put things in is generally a water quality box, and that can include anything from nitrates to groundwater use, irrigation, nitrogen application, runoff, ditches, and then we also have the chemical side, bans on Roundup, chlorpyrifos, dicamba. We've seen those bills, especially in the House in recent years, and sometimes they get a little airtime. So we expect to see some of those things if the legislature gets into policy. So with that, those are my prepared remarks on the Minnesota legislature. And as I said, beginning, Amber and I will take any questions you have and try our best to answer them. I said I have a little screen down here that I can check, and I don't see anything right now. So we can give that a minute or two and see if we get anything in.
If you have any questions, you can enter them in the Q&A or the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Bruce, we have one. We have a question. Any update on waterway buffer strips?
Any update on buffer strips? Not in the buffer law itself that I've seen. There's been discussions about tax credits in past years, and part of what happens there is the administration of that. If you go back to the buffer law, it's a few feet along the ditch, along the waterway. But when you talk about the property tax, you're talking about the parcel, which is the 40 or the 80 or the quarter. So to carve that out, the counties have raised an issue of administration. So the most recent discussion we had in the last 2 years on that has been, is there a way to get the counties a general fund appropriation that represents the amount of the buffer, but goes to the county to offset the budget or to give some sort of revenue, really in the form of kind of a PILT payment in lieu of tax. That's the most recent discussion we've had. I haven't seen any lawsuits. Years ago, I would come to this convention and say someone's going to do a lawsuit. I haven't seen of any. I have heard about enforcement starting. Polk County is starting to send letters, for example, by Crookston. But generally, it's been kind of quiet on the buffer front. So I don't know if you have anything to add, Amber, but that's what I'm recalling on buffers at this time.
I agree with you, Bruce. I think definitely the biggest conversation has been on what that tax credit or what that could look like moving forward. But I don't think we found that magical answer, but we'll continue to work on those issues and on implementation. But we do know that implementation has been going well across the state, and those numbers are up there.
I see a question here, how the leadership in the Minnesota House will affect the dynamics of the new combined committee. I think this question, if I understand it right, is about the possibility of combining the Ag and Environment Committee. The Ag Committee was, it involves finance and policy. And there was concern with the loss of Representative Poppy that perhaps the Ag and Environment Committees would be combined. That actually happened back in 2013 and 2014 when we had all DFL leadership in the House, Senate, and Governor's office back in those days. And what the House leadership did in 2013 is they combined the Ag and Environment Committees, and then they handed the chairmanship to an environmentalist from Minneapolis, Gene Wavenius. And so with Representative Poppy's loss, that started some discussion amongst the lobbyists about whether the committees would be combined again. And fortunately, those committees were not combined. As I mentioned, Representative Sundin from ESCO has the Ag Policy and Finance Committee, and Representative Rick Hansen has the Environment, Finance, and Policy Committee. So if the question is referring to combined committees for Ag, they were kind of combined before, but the Environment Committees were not. It was a separate policy and a separate Finance Committee. Those have been combined. So if that's the nature of the question, I don't think it'll make a lot of difference because most of the policy issues that went through the Environment Policy Committee had fiscal impacts, and they'd eventually find their way into the Environment Finance Committee anyway. The policy things that would escape the finance review would be things like game and fish and mostly in that arena, not so much in Ag. Anything involving Ag, whether it was feedlots or buffers or water quality, always wound up in the Finance Committee anyway. So I think the net effect is there won't be much change on any of those fronts. Good. Anything to add there, Amber?
I think you covered that one well, Bruce.
I've got a question here from Howard Olson. Bruce, I know you're an expert in neonics. A couple more insecticides have been added to the surface water pesticides of concern list. What does that mean when they're added to that list? Will they still be available?
Sure. All right. So the question's on neonics and being designated as surface waters of concern. So I'll give you the Reader's Digest on this. Back in 1989, there was something called the Groundwater Protection Act. And that act set out jurisdiction about water. So the MPCA has jurisdiction over surface waters and chemicals, and the Department of Ag has jurisdiction over groundwater and fertilizer. Now, within that scheme, the Department of Ag is charged with addressing ag chemicals. They formed a committee many, many years ago. It's called the Pesticide Management Committee. And the department put out a plan on how to manage ag chemicals. And when they designate something as a surface water of concern, that the first thing it does is trigger something called best management practices. So for many years, for example, atrazine was in that camp. Atrazine, the best management practices were you had to stay so far away from the tile line in the ditch when you applied it. You had to do it when the wind speed was low, beyond what was on the label. So designating the neonics, two of the three products, means that BMPs will be triggered. And so the department will develop those, and those will be effective. So the short answer is the products will still be available, but two of them will have to follow best management practices. If that goes on for a few years and there still gets to be surface waters of concern, the next step would be more of a regulatory action, but we are not at that stage right now.
Bruce, I do have one more thing. It's not related to the question, but I do want to just highlight that I want to make sure farmers have seen the announcement from the Minnesota Department of Ag a few days ago about the registration of dicamba in Minnesota. The Department of Ag has announced that it will follow the federal registration and label usage for dicamba in Minnesota. That does mean a application cutoff date of June 30th, unless it has the growth stage cutoff that comes first with a couple of the products. So we will follow the federal label. The FDA is also requiring product makers to provide approved education and training of applicators and provide more Minnesota-specific data on the use of dicamba to inform future decisions. But good news to see that come from the Department of Ag just a few days ago.
One more question for you guys here.
Good point, Timber.
Is there a chance of overturning the buffer land grab?
Is there a chance of overturning the buffer land grab? No. It's just not going to have the support. Even if you got it through the House, I don't think Walsh would sign a bill like that. So people have just generally moved on from that discussion. The conversation has been more about compensation, like I mentioned, but overturning it, unless a court does it, I just don't see the legislature taking it up.
Completely agree.
Got another question here. What are the main changes you feel we'll see without Colin Peterson representing this district? Are there concerns you have with this change going forward? That's a good question.
I'm going to pass that to the federal expert.
I think the biggest change we're going to see with Colin Peterson no longer serving in the House is honestly from a national perspective more than a district concern. I think we saw a lot of states watching this race very closely. His expertise in the House Ag Committee, especially from a Midwestern perspective, has been obviously the standard for years. And so as we move forward, the leadership is coming more from the South, with the chairman coming from Georgia and the ranking member from Pennsylvania. So that's definitely a switch. I think I am excited to hear that they are, want to follow in Chair Peterson's footsteps. I think as we look from CD7 specifically here in Minnesota, I think we're excited to work with Congresswoman-elect Fishbach. I know she has a huge interest in agriculture, has indicated that she wants to serve on the Ag Committee. Obviously, it's in the minority and not in the majority in that committee, and obviously not in leadership either, but do appreciate her interest in agriculture and knowing the importance of that in the district. But regardless, definitely a big loss for agriculture across the country with the loss of the chairman, but looking forward to continuing to make progress on ag issues.
Are we all done?
I think you are.
All right. Thanks for your time, everybody.